The dust on her boots was as thick as the anger in her voice, and Nathan Foster could hear the argument from 3 storefronts away as he led his horse down the main street of Fort Yuma, California in the sweltering August heat of 1878. "You promised me $12 for those pelts, and I delivered every single one in perfect condition," the young woman said, her voice steady despite the obvious tension radiating through her slim frame. She stood in front of the trading post, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her calico dress dusty from travel, but her posture unwavering. The trader, a portly man named Henderson with sweat staining the armpits of his shirt, waved his hand dismissively. "That was before I examined them properly, miss. Some of these have imperfections. I will give you $7, and that is generous." Nathan tied his horse to the hitching post and found himself drawn toward the confrontation. He had been traveling for 6 weeks, moving cattle from Texas to California, and his body ached with exhaustion. But something about the woman's stance, the righteous fury in her words, made him pause. "There are no imperfections," she said, her hands clenched at her sides. "I spent 2 months trapping those rabbits and preparing those pelts properly. My father taught me how to do it right, and I know quality work when I see it." "Well, your father is not here, is he?" Henderson said with a cruel smile. "Now take the $7 or take your pelts and leave." Nathan stepped onto the wooden boardwalk, his boots making a solid sound that caused both parties to look his way. He was tall, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that needed cutting, his blue eyes taking in the scene with quick assessment. The woman looked to be in her early 20s, with a face that was more striking than pretty, all strong bones and determined angles. Her green eyes were bright with barely suppressed emotion. "Excuse me," Nathan said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone who had learned patience in harsh landscapes. "I could not help but overhear. Did you promise this young lady $12 for those pelts?" Henderson's face flushed an ugly red. "This is none of your concern, stranger." "Maybe not," Nathan agreed, moving closer to examine the stack of rabbit pelts lying on the wooden counter outside the store. He picked up several, running his calloused fingers over the soft fur, checking the leather backing with the practiced eye of someone who had traded furs himself in leaner years. "But these are quality pelts, properly cleaned, well stretched, no damage to the fur. These are worth $12 if they are worth a penny." "I said 7, Henderson insisted. Nathan set the pelts down carefully and turned his full attention to the trader. He was not a violent man by nature, but he had learned young that sometimes the mere suggestion of consequence could move mountains. He let his hand rest casually near the gun at his hip, not threatening, just present. "Give her what she earned," Nathan said quietly, and something in his tone made Henderson take a step backward. The woman was staring at Nathan with a mixture of surprise and wariness, clearly unused to anyone standing up for her. Henderson sputtered for a moment, then reached into his cash box with shaking fingers and counted out 12 silver dollars, slapping them onto the counter with more force than necessary. "There," he said. "Now both of you get away from my store." The woman scooped up the coins with quick, efficient movements, tucking them into a small leather pouch at her waist. "Thank you for your business, Mr. Henderson," she said with icy politeness, then turned to Nathan. "And thank you, stranger. I did not need your help, but I appreciate it nonetheless." She started to walk away, her spine straight, but Nathan found himself following. "Wait," he called. "Miss, I did not mean to imply you could not handle yourself." She stopped and turned, one eyebrow raised. "Then why did you intervene?" "Because it was the right thing to do," Nathan said simply. "And because I have a sister back in Texas, and I would hope someone would do the same for her if she was being cheated." The woman studied him for a long moment, and Nathan felt oddly exposed under that green-eyed gaze. Finally, she nodded. "Julia Patterson," she said, not offering her hand but giving him her name like a gift. Nathan Foster," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Patterson." "Just Julia," she said. "And you're right, those were quality pelts. My father taught me everything about trapping and preparing game before he died 3 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," Nathan said, meaning it. Julia shrugged, but he could see the old pain flicker across her features. "Life in Fort Yuma is not easy for a woman alone. I do what I must to survive." "You have no family?" Nathan found himself asking, drawn into conversation despite having planned to simply find a hotel room and sleep for a day straight. My mother passed when I was 15, Julia said, starting to walk down the street, and Nathan fell into step beside her, leading his horse. My father lasted 5 more years before a rattlesnake bite took him. I have been on my own since then. Nathan did some quick calculation. You must be about 20 or so now. 22, Julia corrected. And you? 26, Nathan said. I have been working cattle drives for the past 8 years, saving money to buy my own land someday. They walked in companionable silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun beating down on the dusty street. Fort Yuma was a rough town, situated near the confluence of the Gila and Colorado rivers, serving as both a military post and a civilian settlement. The heat was legendary, often reaching well over 100 degrees in the summer months, and Nathan could feel sweat trickling down his spine, despite having grown accustomed to harsh weather. "Where are you staying?" Nathan asked. Julia gestured vaguely toward the eastern edge of town. "I have a small cabin about a mile out. It was my parents' place. Not much, but it is mine." "Do you have a horse?" Nathan noticed she was on foot. "Had one," Julia said shortly. "Sold him last month to pay for supplies. I've been walking or borrowing when I need to travel farther." Nathan frowned. A woman alone without a horse in this territory was vulnerable in ways that made him uncomfortable. "That seems dangerous." "I told you I'd do what I must," Julia said, an edge creeping into her voice. "I did not ask for your pity, Nathan Foster." "Not pity," Nathan said quickly. "Respect. You are surviving in conditions that would break most people, but that does not mean I cannot worry." Julia stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Why do you care? You're just passing through, are you not? Another drifter looking for work or running from something." "Not running from anything," Nathan said. "And yes, I was just passing through. I finished a cattle drive and was planning to rest here for a few days before heading north to look at some land near Sacramento that might be for sale." "Then why are we talking?" Julia asked, but there was curiosity in her voice now rather than hostility. Nathan considered the question seriously. "Because when I saw you standing up to that traitor, refusing to back down even though he was trying to cheat you, I thought you were the bravest person I had seen in a long time. And because I've been lonely on the trail, and it is nice to talk to someone who does not smell like cattle." A small smile tugged at the corner of Julia's mouth, the first softening he had seen in her stern features. "Well, I probably smell like rabbit pelts and desert dust, so I'm not sure I'm much better." "Much better than cattle, trust me," Nathan assured her, and was rewarded with a quiet laugh. They had reached a small restaurant, little more than a shack with rough tables inside, and a sign proclaiming Maria's Kitchen in faded paint. Nathan's stomach growled audibly, reminding him he had eaten nothing but jerky and hardtack for breakfast. "Have you eaten?" he asked impulsively. Julia hesitated. "I should get home before dark." "It will not be dark for 3 hours yet," Nathan pointed out, "and I would appreciate the company. My treat, as a thank you for tolerating my interference earlier." He could see the internal debate playing across Julia's expressive face. Pride warred with practicality, and probably hunger as well. Finally, she nodded. "Just a quick meal," she said. "I do not want charity." "Not charity," Nathan said. "Just dinner between two people who could both use a friendly face." They settled at one of the rough wooden tables inside the restaurant, which was blessedly dim after the glaring sun outside. A Mexican woman in her 50s, presumably Maria, took their order with a warm smile. Nathan ordered steak and beans for both of them, along with fresh bread and coffee. As they waited for the food, Nathan found himself studying Julia in the softer light. She was beautiful in an unconventional way, all strength and sharp edges. Her hands, resting on the table, were work-roughened but graceful, and there was intelligence in her eyes that suggested a quick mind behind the wary exterior. "Tell me about your land," Julia said, breaking the silence. "The property near Sacramento." Nathan leaned back in his chair. "It is nothing definite yet, just a possibility. A friend from an old cattle drive wrote to me about 160 acres that might be for sale. Good water, some timber, enough flat land for crops or grazing, the kind of place where a man could build something lasting." That sounds nice, Julia said, and there was a wistfulness in her voice that made Nathan's heart ache. What about you? He asked. Do you plan to stay in Fort Yuma? Julia looked out the small window at the dusty street. Where else would I go? This is all I know. My cabin is here, my parents are buried here. Besides, traveling requires money I do not have. The food arrived, steaming and plentiful, and they ate in comfortable silence for several minutes. Nathan noticed that Julia ate quickly but neatly, the habits of someone who was often hungry but retained her dignity. He pushed the basket of bread closer to her side of the table without comment. This Henderson fellow, Nathan said after a while. Does he always try to cheat you? Julia's jaw tightened. He knows I need the money, so he pushes as much as he can. But he is not the only trader in town. I've worked with others, though Henderson usually pays the best, assuming he actually pays what he promises. Why not report him to the law? The law? Julia laughed bitterly. The sheriff is Henderson's brother-in-law. Besides, the word of a lone woman against an established businessman. You saw how quickly Henderson changed his tune when you showed up. That is how the world works. Nathan could not argue with her assessment, much as he disliked it. He had seen similar injustices throughout his travels. What other work do you do besides trapping? Whatever I can find, Julia said. I take in laundry sometimes, mend clothes, help with cooking at the fort when they need extra hands. I can shoot well enough to hunt for meat to sell. I have worked in the gardens of some of the wealthier families when they need day labor. Nothing is beneath me if it keeps me fed and housed. That is admirable, Nathan said quietly. That is survival, Julia corrected, but her tone was less sharp now. What about you? You said you have been working cattle drives. Is that all you have done? Nathan considered his answer as he sipped his coffee. Mostly yes. I grew up on a small farm in Texas, the youngest of 5 children. When I was 18, my parents had enough kids to work the land, so I set out to make my own way. Worked as a ranch hand for a while, then started hiring on for the long drives to railheads and markets. The pay is decent if you survive the journey, and I have always been good with cattle and horses. No desire to settle down, Julia asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. Plenty of desire, Nathan admitted. Just waiting for the right opportunity and, well, the right person to settle down with. Their eyes met across the table, and something electric passed between them. Julia looked away first, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, and Nathan felt his own face grow warm. He had not meant to be so forward, but there was something about Julia Patterson that made him want to be honest. I should go, Julia said, standing abruptly. It will take me almost an hour to walk home, and I need to set traps for tomorrow. Nathan stood as well, tossing coins on the table to cover their meal. Let me walk you home, he offered. Or better yet, let me give you a ride. My horse can carry 2. That's not necessary, Julia began, but Nathan held up a hand. Please, he said. It would make me feel better and it will save you time. No ulterior motives, I promise. Just practical help from one person to another. Julia studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, she said. Thank you. They walked back to where Nathan had left his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Red. Nathan swung up into the saddle, then offered Julia his hand. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, allowing him to pull her up behind him. She sat carefully, not quite touching him, but as they started moving, she was forced to hold onto his waist for balance. Nathan tried to ignore the feeling of her hands against his sides, the warmth of her body behind his. He had been around women before, had even courted a few over the years, but something about Julia affected him differently. Maybe it was her fierce independence, or the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide, or simply the connection he had felt from the moment he heard her standing up for herself against Henderson. Julia directed him east, away from the main cluster of buildings that made up Fort Yuma. The landscape was harsh desert scrub, scattered with mesquite and creosote bush, the Colorado River visible as a ribbon of darker green vegetation in the distance. The sun was lowering toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It is beautiful here, Nathan said, meaning it. In a stark way. It grows on you, Julia said from behind him. When I was younger, I used to hate the heat and the dust, but now I cannot imagine living anywhere else. There is an honesty to the desert. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. They rode in silence for a while, and Nathan felt Julia gradually relax against him, her grip on his waist becoming less tentative. By the time they reached her cabin, the sun was painting everything in gold light. The cabin was small but well maintained, a single-room structure with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. There was a lean-to stable that stood empty, a reminder of the horse Julia had been forced to sell. A vegetable garden, wilted in the heat but still alive, occupied a patch of ground near what looked like a well. Nathan dismounted first, then helped Julia down. She stepped away quickly, putting proper distance between them. "Thank you for the ride," she said, "and for the meal, and for helping with Henderson." "It was my pleasure," Nathan said, and meant it. He stood there awkwardly, not wanting to leave but having no real excuse to stay. "Julia, I know we just met, but I am going to be in Fort Yuma for a few days. Would you mind if I called on you again?" Julia looked surprised. "Why would you want to do that?" "Because I enjoy your company," Nathan said honestly, "because I think you are interesting and brave, and because I would like to get to know you better." "I am not looking for charity or pity," Julia said, but there was hope flickering in her eyes. "And I'm not offering either," Nathan assured her. "Just friendship, and maybe, if you are amenable, the possibility of something more." Julia was quiet for so long that Nathan thought she might refuse. Then she nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "You can call on me. But I will not pretend to be something I am not. This is my life, difficult and rough as it is." "I would not want you to pretend anything," Nathan said. "That is part of what I admire about you. Your honesty." A genuine smile crossed Julia's face, transforming her features. "Tomorrow, then," she said. "Come by in the afternoon if you like. I will be working on tanning a deer hide I traded for last week." "I will be here," Nathan promised. He rode back to Fort Yuma as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of purple and deep blue. His body was still exhausted from the long cattle drive, but his mind was racing. Something significant had happened today. He could feel it in his bones. Meeting Julia Patterson felt like the beginning of something important, though he could not have said exactly what. He found a room at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman who had settled in Fort Yuma after her husband died working on the railroad. The room was clean and cheap, and Nathan fell asleep to the sound of wind rattling the shutters, dreaming of green eyes and fierce determination. The next afternoon, Nathan found himself back at Julia's cabin, this time bringing supplies he had purchased that morning. He had flour, sugar, coffee, and a selection of vegetables that looked fresher than what he had seen struggling in Julia's garden. He also brought a new skinning knife he had noticed in the general store window, the kind with a good balance and sharp edge that would make Julia's work easier. Julia came out onto the porch as he approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She had been working as promised, and there was a deer hide stretched on a frame in the yard, half scraped clean of tissue and membrane. "You did not need to bring anything," she said, eyeing the supplies in his saddlebags, but Nathan could see she was pleased. "I know I did not need to," Nathan said, dismounting, "but I wanted to. Besides, I'm hoping you will let me help with your work, and it seems only fair to contribute something in return for the company." Julia helped him carry the supplies inside, and Nathan got his first look at the interior of her home. It was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed in one corner, a small table and 2 chairs, a wood stove for cooking, and shelves holding a modest collection of dishes and supplies. Herbs hung drying from the rafters, filling the space with the scent of sage and rosemary. "It is not much," Julia said, following his gaze. "It is honest," Nathan replied, "and you have made it a home. That is more than many people manage." They spent the afternoon working together on the deer hide. Nathan had some experience with tanning from his younger years on the farm, and he fell into an easy rhythm working alongside Julia. They talked as they worked, sharing stories of their lives. Nathan learned that Julia's father had been a trapper and a hunter who had come to California during the gold rush, but had found more success in providing meat and furs to miners than in panning for gold. Her mother had been the daughter of Mexican settlers, teaching Julia to speak Spanish and to appreciate the heritage of the land they lived on. Julia learned that Nathan had left Texas not because of any trouble, but simply from a desire to see more of the world and build something of his own. He told her about the cattle drives, the long days of dust and heat, the river crossings that could turn deadly in moments, the stampedes that could happen for no reason at all. He also told her about the satisfaction of delivering a herd safely, of knowing he had done his job well. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Nathan felt himself growing more comfortable with Julia, and sensed she felt the same. Her initial wariness had faded, replaced by something warmer. She laughed at his stories, shared her own experiences, and worked alongside him with an easy competence that he found deeply attractive. "Stay for dinner," Julia said as the sun began to set. "It is the least I can do after you brought all these supplies." Nathan agreed readily, and they prepared a simple meal together. Julia made tortillas from the flour, heating them on the stovetop while Nathan cooked beans and fried some of the vegetables he had brought. They ate outside on the porch, watching the colors bleed across the desert sky. "I have been thinking," Nathan said as they finished eating, "about what you said yesterday about needing money. I have some saved from the cattle drive. I would like to help you." Julia stiffened immediately. "I told you I do not want charity." "Not charity," Nathan said quickly. "A business arrangement. You need a horse, right? I could buy you one, and you could pay me back when you are able. No interest, no rush." "Why would you do that?" Julia asked, suspicion and hope warring in her voice. "Because I care about what happens to you," Nathan said simply. "Because I know we just met, but I feel like this is the beginning of something important. And because I want to help, not out of pity, but because when you care about someone, you want to make their life easier if you can." Julia was quiet for a long time, staring out at the desert. "I'm not used to people helping me," she finally said, "not without expecting something in return." "I do not expect anything," Nathan said, "except maybe that you will let me keep visiting you, getting to know you better." "Just visiting?" Julia asked, and there was something new in her voice, a note of possibility. "For now," Nathan said, "unless you want more. Then we can talk about that too." Julia turned to look at him, and in the fading light, her eyes seemed to glow. "I would like you to kiss me," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "If you want to." Nathan's heart hammered in his chest. "Are you sure?" "I am sure," Julia said. "I've been thinking about it since yesterday, wondering what it would feel like." Nathan stood slowly, closing the distance between them. He cupped Julia's face gently with one calloused hand, giving her time to change her mind. When she did not pull away, he lowered his head and kissed her softly. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, an exploration, but then Julia's hands came up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer, and the kiss deepened. Nathan felt something shift inside him, a recognition that this woman, this fierce and independent and beautiful woman, was going to change his life. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Julia laughed shakily. "That was better than I imagined," she admitted. "I have been wanting to do that since yesterday," Nathan confessed, "since I saw you standing up to Henderson." "That is an odd thing to find attractive," Julia teased, but she was smiling. "Everything about you is attractive," Nathan said seriously. "Your strength, your honesty, your determination to survive on your own terms." They stood together on the porch as full darkness fell, and Nathan knew he should leave, ride back to town before it got too late. But he found himself reluctant to go, wanting to stay in this moment of connection. "Come back tomorrow," Julia said softly. "And the day after, if you can. I know you said you were only staying in Fort Yuma for a few days, but I would like to spend as much of that time with you as possible." "I will be here," Nathan promised, "every day until I have to leave." Over the next week, Nathan fell into a pattern. He would ride out to Julia's cabin each morning, bringing whatever supplies he thought she might need. They would work together on her various projects, tanning hides, mending fences, tending the garden. In the afternoons, they would sometimes ride double on Red, exploring the area around Fort Yuma. Nathan showed Julia how to track game more efficiently, techniques he had learned from Native American friends during his time on the trail. Julia taught Nathan about the desert plants, which ones were edible, which could be used for medicine, which would kill you if you were foolish enough to try them. They talked endlessly, sharing their dreams and fears. Nathan told Julia about his plans for the land near Sacramento, describing the house he wanted to build, the crops he might plant, the life he wanted to create. Julia listened with an intensity that made Nathan's heart ache, because he could see how much she wanted something similar, but had convinced herself it was impossible. On the 5th day, Nathan bought Julia a horse, a gentle mare named Daisy with a golden coat and kind eyes. When he led the horse to Julia's cabin, Julia burst into tears, the first time Nathan had seen her cry. "I cannot accept this," she said, even as she stroked the mare's nose with trembling hands. "You can and you will," Nathan said firmly. "Consider it a loan if it makes you feel better. Pay me back over the next year, or 5 years, or never. I do not care. I just want you to be safe." "Why are you doing this?" Julia asked through her tears. "Why do you care so much?" Nathan pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "Because I am falling in love with you," he said quietly. "I know it is fast, maybe too fast, but it is the truth. I've never felt this way about anyone before." Julia pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "I'm falling in love with you too," she admitted, "and it terrifies me. What happens when you leave? When you go north to look at your land?" "Come with me," Nathan said impulsively. The words surprised him even as he said them, but as soon as they were out, he knew they were right. "Come with me to Sacramento. We can look at the land together, decide if it is right for us." "Us?" Julia whispered. "Us," Nathan confirmed. "I want to build that life I have been dreaming about, but I want to build it with you. Marry me, Julia. I know it is sudden, but we are not children. We both know our own minds. I know what I want, and I want you." Julia was quiet for so long that Nathan's heart sank, thinking he had pushed too hard, moved too fast. But then she smiled, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you. And yes, I will come with you to Sacramento. I was so afraid you would leave and I would never see you again. I have been dreading it every day." Nathan kissed her then, pouring all of his relief and joy and love into the embrace. When they finally broke apart, both were grinning like fools. They were married 3 days later by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through Fort Yuma. Mrs. Chen from the boarding house and Maria from the restaurant served as witnesses. Julia wore a simple blue dress that Maria had loaned her, and Nathan wore his cleanest shirt and pants. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Nathan felt like his entire life had been leading to this moment. They spent their wedding night in Julia's cabin, which would soon no longer be hers. Nathan was gentle with his new wife, mindful of her inexperience, and Julia was brave and curious and beautiful in his arms. Afterward, they lay together in the narrow bed, talking about their future. "I need to sell the cabin," Julia said, her head resting on Nathan's chest, "and settle my affairs here. It will take a few days." "Take all the time you need," Nathan said, stroking her hair. "We are in no rush. The land will still be there whenever we arrive." Over the next week, they prepared for their departure. Julia sold her cabin to a young couple who had just arrived in Fort Yuma, hoping to make their fortune. She got a fair price, which she insisted on giving to Nathan to repay him for the horse and supplies, though he tried to refuse. "We are partners now," she said firmly. "What is mine is yours, and what is yours is mine. That includes debts and assets both." Nathan could only admire her practical approach to their marriage. Julia was not sentimental about leaving Fort Yuma. She visited her parents' graves one last time, leaving wildflowers on the simple markers, but she did not cry. Instead, she looked forward with determination. "They would want me to be happy," she told Nathan. "They would approve of you, I think. My father always said the measure of a man was not in his words, but in his actions. You have shown me through your actions that you are a good man." On a clear morning in early September, Nathan and Julia Foster set out for Sacramento. They traveled light, with Red and Daisy carrying their possessions, heading north through the California territory. The journey would take several weeks, but neither of them minded. It felt like an adventure, the beginning of their new life together. They followed established trails when they could, camping under the stars at night. Nathan taught Julia to shoot better, and she proved to be a quick study, her steady hands and sharp eye making her an excellent markswoman. Julia taught Nathan more about desert plants and animals, knowledge that served them well as they traveled. They passed through small settlements and avoided large towns when possible, preferring the solitude of the open trail. At night, they would lie together in their bedroll, talking and making love and dreaming about the future. "What if the land is not suitable?" Julia asked one night as they lay watching the stars. Then we will find other land, Nathan said. The specific location does not matter as much as building something together. I want children, Julia said softly. At least 2, maybe more. I know it is early to talk about such things, but I want you to know. I want children too, Nathan assured her. I want to build something that will last beyond us, a legacy for our family. They reached Sacramento in late September, and Nathan's friend directed them to the land he had mentioned in his letter. It was everything Nathan had hoped for, and more. The 160 acres included a creek with year-round water, stands of oak and pine trees, and gently rolling meadows perfect for crops or livestock. The soil was rich, nothing like the desert hardpan around Fort Yuma. It is beautiful, Julia breathed, looking out over the land. It is like something from a dream. Can you see yourself living here? Nathan asked anxiously. Building our home here? I can see us raising our children here, Julia said, turning to smile at him. Growing old here together? Yes, Nathan, this is perfect. Nathan negotiated the purchase over the next few days, using his savings and the money from Julia's cabin sale. The land was theirs by the first week of October, and they immediately set to work building a house. They started with a simple cabin, similar to what Julia had lived in but larger, with a separate bedroom and a real kitchen. Nathan proved to be a skilled carpenter, and Julia learned quickly, working alongside him from sunrise to sunset. Neighbors from the nearest settlement, about 5 miles away, came to help with the raising of the walls and roof, accepting Julia and Nathan into the community with genuine warmth. By the time the first rains of autumn arrived, they had a solid roof over their heads and a functioning fireplace. They spent the winter months finishing the interior of the house, building furniture, and planting their first crops for spring. Julia discovered she was pregnant in January of 1879, and Nathan could barely contain his joy. He became even more protective of his wife, trying to take on all the heavy work himself, but Julia would have none of it. I am pregnant, not fragile, she told him. Women have been having babies while working for thousands of years. I will not stop living just because I am carrying our child. Still, Nathan worried, and Julia found his concern endearing even when it became overbearing. They prepared a corner of the cabin to serve as a nursery, and Julia sewed blankets and small clothes while Nathan carved a cradle from oak wood. Their son was born in early September, a healthy baby with his mother's green eyes and his father's strong features. They named him James after Julia's father, and Nathan held his son with trembling hands, overcome with emotion. He is perfect, Nathan whispered, tears streaming down his face. You are amazing, Julia. I cannot believe we made this. Julia, exhausted but radiant, smiled up at her husband. We made a family, she corrected, and this is just the beginning. They settled into the rhythms of family life. Julia proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving but firm when needed. Nathan was equally devoted, often waking in the night to tend to James so Julia could rest. During the day, they worked the land together, with James sleeping in a basket under the shade of a tree or tied to Julia's back in the tradition she had learned from Native American women her father had known. Their first harvest was modest but successful. They planted wheat and vegetables, raised chickens for eggs and meat, and acquired a milk cow from a neighbor. The land provided generously, and they felt blessed beyond measure. When James was 2 years old, Julia became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, a tiny thing with dark hair and her father's blue eyes. James was initially unsure about the new baby, but quickly became protective of his little sister. The years passed in a pattern of hard work and simple joys. Nathan added onto their house, creating more rooms as their family grew. Julia established a large garden and learned to can and preserve food for the winters. They acquired more livestock, including a small herd of cattle that Nathan managed with the expertise gained from his years on the trail. Their third child, another son they named Samuel, was born when James was 5 and Rose was 3. The cabin rang with the sounds of children laughing and playing, and Nathan often paused in his work to simply marvel at the life they had built. The community around them grew as well. More settlers arrived, drawn by the good land and fair weather. A small town sprang up at the crossroads 5 miles from their property, complete with a general store, a church, and eventually a school. Julia was active in the community, helping new families settle, and teaching other women the skills she had learned in the harsh environment of Fort Yuma. Nathan served on the town council and helped organize a volunteer fire brigade after a lightning strike nearly destroyed a neighbor's barn. He was respected for his fairness and his willingness to help anyone in need, traits that Julia loved him for even more as the years passed. When James turned 7, Nathan began teaching him to work the cattle, just as Nathan's own father had taught him. Julia taught Rose to garden and cook and sew, though Rose also showed an interest in her father's work and often tagged along with James to watch the men handle the livestock. "She is going to be a handful," Nathan observed one evening, watching Rose convince James to let her try roping a fence post. "She is her mother's daughter," Julia said with a smile, "independent and stubborn." "I would not have her any other way," Nathan said, pulling Julia close. "Just like her mother." They had been married for nearly 10 years, and Nathan still felt the same rush of love when he looked at Julia that he had felt that first day in Fort Yuma. She had changed, as he had. The hardness she had carried from years of struggling alone had softened, replaced by the confidence of a woman who was loved and secure. Lines had appeared at the corners of her eyes from years of squinting in the sun and laughing at her children's antics. Nathan had changed too. The restless wanderer who had drifted from cattle drive to cattle drive had become a settled family man, his roots sunk deep into the land they had built their lives upon. His hands bore the scars of hard work, his face was weathered by sun and wind, but his eyes still lit up whenever Julia entered a room. "Do you ever miss it?" Julia asked one night as they sat on the porch after the children had gone to bed. "The traveling? The freedom of the trail?" Nathan considered the question seriously. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity of it," he admitted, "the clear purpose of moving cattle from one place to another. But I would not trade what we have for anything. This life, our family, our land, this is everything I ever wanted, even before I knew I wanted it." "I never imagined I could be this happy," Julia confessed. "When I was alone in Fort Yuma, I thought that was all my life would ever be. Struggling to survive day after day, you gave me a future I never dared to dream about." "We gave each other a future," Nathan corrected. "I was drifting before I met you, living without purpose beyond the next paycheck. You gave me a reason to settle down, to build something lasting." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their land. An owl hooted in the distance, and somewhere one of the horses whinnied softly. The sky was brilliant with stars, and a warm breeze carried the scent of growing things. "I am pregnant again," Julia said suddenly, and Nathan turned to her in surprise. "Are you certain?" "I am certain," Julia confirmed, placing a hand on her still flat stomach. "About 2 months along, I think. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Nathan let out a whoop of joy, then quickly covered his mouth, remembering the children sleeping inside. He pulled Julia into his arms, holding her tight. "4 children," he marveled. "We are going to need an even bigger house." "We can afford it now," Julia pointed out. "The last few harvests have been good, and your cattle are bringing excellent prices." "I will start planning an addition tomorrow," Nathan promised. "We will need more bedrooms anyway as the children get older." Their 4th child, a daughter they named Grace, was born the following spring. She was a calm baby, content to observe the world with solemn dark eyes, a contrast to her more boisterous siblings. Life continued its steady pattern. The children grew and flourished. James developed a passion for working with animals and showed a natural talent for training horses. Rose, as predicted, grew into a spirited young girl who could ride as well as any boy and had no patience for traditional feminine restrictions. Samuel was the scholar of the family, always reading when he could get his hands on a book, his mind quick and curious. Grace remained the quiet one, a thoughtful child who noticed everything and spoke rarely but wisely. Nathan and Julia watched their children grow with pride and amazement. The house expanded as needed, eventually becoming a substantial 2-story structure with a large kitchen, a proper parlor, and enough bedrooms for everyone. The land prospered under their careful stewardship, and they became known throughout the region as fair and honest people. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Nathan surprised Julia with a trip to San Francisco, leaving the children in the care of trusted neighbors. It was the first time they had been alone together for more than a day since James was born, and they reveled in the freedom. They stayed in a hotel that seemed impossibly luxurious after years of frontier living. They ate in restaurants, attended a theater performance, and walked along the waterfront watching ships come and go from around the world. But mostly, they simply enjoyed being together without the demands of children and farm constantly pulling at their attention. "This is wonderful," Julia said as they walked hand in hand through the city. "But I miss the children already." "So do I," Nathan admitted. "I never thought I would be the kind of man who missed the noise and chaos of a full house. But I do." "We have built a good life," Julia said. "Better than I ever imagined possible. Do you remember that day in Fort Yuma when you told Henderson to give me what I earned?" "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever seen," Nathan said, standing there refusing to back down, even though you were alone and he had all the power. "I was so angry," Julia recalled, "and so scared, though I tried not to show it. I needed that money desperately, and then you appeared like something out of a story and everything changed." "Everything changed for me, too," Nathan said. "I'd been looking for something without knowing what it was. And then I saw you, and I knew. You were what I had been searching for." They returned home after a week in the city, and the children rushed to greet them with a cacophony of voices, all trying to share everything that had happened while they were gone. Nathan swept Grace up in his arms while Julia hugged Rose and listened to Samuel's detailed account of a book he had finished. James, nearly 16 now and self-conscious about displays of affection, still grinned to see his parents home safely. The years continued to pass. James met a young woman at a church social and courted her with Nathan's patient guidance. They married when James was 20, and Nathan deeded them 40 acres of the family land to start their own farm. It was hard to watch his son leave, but Nathan remembered his own need for independence at that age and did not try to hold James back. Rose shocked everyone by announcing at 18 that she wanted to become a teacher. She left for Sacramento to attend a training program, writing home regularly with accounts of her studies. Nathan was so proud he could barely speak, and Julia kept her daughter's letters in a special box, reading them over and over. Samuel, no surprise to anyone, won a scholarship to attend college in San Francisco. He studied law and promised to return to their region to practice, wanting to serve the community he had grown up in. Grace, their quiet youngest, fell in love with a neighboring farmer's son and married at 19. She and her husband settled nearby, and Grace visited often, bringing her own children to meet their grandparents. Nathan and Julia became grandparents, then grandparents many times over as their children's families grew. The house that had once rang with their own children's voices now filled regularly with the laughter of grandchildren. Nathan built a large addition specifically for family gatherings, with a huge dining table that could seat 20 people comfortably. On their 30th wedding anniversary, the entire family gathered to celebrate. James came with his wife and 5 children. Rose arrived from Sacramento with her husband, a fellow teacher, and their 3 children. Samuel brought his wife and 2 children. Grace and her family walked over from their nearby farm with their 4 children. Nathan stood on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands, looking out at the land he and Julia had tended for 3 decades. Their original 160 acres had grown to over 400, some purchased, some passed down from neighbors who saw Nathan and Julia as the natural stewards of the land. Julia came to stand beside him, her hair now streaked with silver, her face lined with age but still beautiful in his eyes. She leaned into him, and Nathan wrapped an arm around her waist, marveling at how perfectly she still fit against him after all these years. "We did well," Julia said softly. "Look at all of this. Our children, our grandchildren, this land. We built something real and lasting." "We did," Nathan agreed. "And it all started with you standing up to a cheating traitor, refusing to back down even when it seemed impossible." "And you," Julia said, turning to smile up at him, appearing like a hero from a story, telling him to give me what I earned. "You could have ridden right past. You could have ignored the whole situation." "Impossible," Nathan said, bending to kiss her forehead. "I was drawn to you from the first moment I heard your voice. Some things are meant to be." Their grandson, James's oldest son, came running up to them. "Grandpa, Grandma, are you coming? We are about to cut the cake." Nathan and Julia exchanged a glance, then followed their grandson back to where the family had gathered. The table was laden with food that their children and daughters-in-law had prepared. The cake, made by Grace, was decorated with elaborate frosting roses. They ate and laughed and told stories late into the evening. The grandchildren played games in the yard while the adults sat around the table, the conversation flowing easily between generations. Nathan felt a deep sense of contentment, a bone-deep satisfaction that this was his legacy. Not just the land or the house or the financial security they had built, but the family, the love, the connections that would endure beyond his lifetime. As the sun set and the family began preparing to leave, Nathan pulled Julia aside once more. "I love you," he said, the same words he had spoken thousands of times over the past 30 years, but still meaning them with his whole heart. "I love you too," Julia replied, her eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you for seeing me that day, for standing up for me, for choosing me." "Thank you for saying yes," Nathan countered, "for taking a chance on a drifting cowboy with more dreams than sense." "We made those dreams come true," Julia said, "together." They stood together as the last of the family departed, waving goodbye and calling out reminders to visit soon. When the house was finally quiet, they walked through the rooms, seeing the evidence of the celebration everywhere. But neither of them minded the mess. It was evidence of a life well lived, of family and love and joy. That night, lying in their bed, Nathan thought back to the young man he had been 30 years ago, riding into Fort Yuma with no particular destination in mind. He had been looking for land, for opportunity, for a future he could not quite envision. Instead, he had found Julia, and she had given him everything he had never known to want. "What are you thinking about?" Julia asked, her voice drowsy in the darkness. "About how lucky I am," Nathan said. "About how one decision, one moment of choosing to stop and help someone, changed my entire life." "Changed both our lives," Julia corrected. "I would probably still be in Fort Yuma, alone and struggling, if you had not appeared that day." "You would have survived," Nathan said with certainty. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. You would have found a way." "Maybe," Julia allowed, "but I am glad I did not have to. I'm glad we found each other, glad we built this life together." They drifted off to sleep, comfortable in the familiar warmth of each other's presence. Outside, the land they had cultivated for 3 decades lay quiet under the stars. The creek babbled softly in the distance, the same sound they had fallen asleep to for years. In the barn, the animals settled for the night. On the hill beyond the house, the trees they had planted as saplings now stood tall and strong, their roots deep in the soil. Nathan and Julia Foster had built something that would endure, a legacy of love and hard work and determination. Their children would carry on the work they had started, and their grandchildren after them. The land would provide for generations yet to come, just as it had provided for them. But more than the physical legacy, they had created something intangible but equally important. They had shown their children what love looked like, what partnership meant, what it meant to stand by someone through hardships and joys alike. They had demonstrated that with courage and compassion and unwavering support for each other, anything was possible. As the years continued to pass, Nathan and Julia remained active in the lives of their children and grandchildren. They were the heart of the family, the center that everyone returned to for holidays and celebrations, and sometimes just for comfort during difficult times. Nathan taught his grandsons to work cattle and train horses, passing on the skills he had learned over a lifetime. Julia taught her granddaughters to garden and preserve food, but also to read and think for themselves, to never let anyone cheat them or diminish them, lessons learned from her own hard years in Fort Yuma. They grew old together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. Nathan's hair turned white, and his movements became slower, but his eyes still followed Julia around any room she entered. Julia developed arthritis in her hands, but still worked in her garden every day, refusing to let age stop her from doing what she loved. On their 40th anniversary, they renewed their vows in the small church their community had built 20 years earlier. All of their children and grandchildren attended, along with friends and neighbors who had become family over the decades. It was a simple ceremony, much like their original wedding, but infinitely more meaningful for the 40 years of life and love that stood behind it. "I, Nathan Foster, promise to love, honor, and cherish you, Julia Foster, for whatever time we have left," Nathan said, his voice still strong despite his age, "just as I have loved you every day for the past 40 years. I, Julia Foster, promise to love, honor, and cherish you, Nathan Foster, until my last breath." Julia replied, tears streaming down her weathered face. "You are my heart, my partner, my greatest blessing." They lived another decade after that, watching their family continue to grow and flourish. They held great-grandchildren in their arms and saw their children become grandparents themselves. They celebrated anniversaries and holidays, weathered illnesses and setbacks, and through it all, remained each other's greatest support. Nathan passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, with Julia holding his hand. His last words were, "I love you," spoken to the woman who had been his partner for 50 years. Julia lived another 2 years, spending her time with her family and tending her beloved garden. She spoke often of Nathan, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had never known a world without their grandparents together. When she finally passed, also peacefully in her sleep at 78, her family laid her to rest beside Nathan on the hill, overlooking the land they had built together. Their legacy lived on in the family they had created, in the land they had tended, in the example of love and partnership they had demonstrated for 50 years. Their grandchildren told their own children stories about the grandmother who had survived alone in the harsh desert, and the grandfather who had appeared like a hero to stand up for her. They talked about how one moment of courage and compassion had changed 2 lives forever, creating ripples that spread through generations. The house Nathan built still stood strong, expanded and modified by subsequent generations, but retaining its essential character. The land continued to provide, worked now by great-grandchildren who carried on the traditions Nathan and Julia had established, the values they had lived by: honesty, hard work, compassion, courage, and unwavering support for family, continued to guide their descendants. And if sometimes, on quiet evenings, the current occupants of the old farmhouse felt a sense of presence, of being watched over by benevolent spirits, they attributed it to the enduring love of Nathan and Julia Foster, the cowboy and the fierce young woman whose chance meeting in Fort Yuma had created a legacy of love that would never die.